Hello, and welcome to the ZzZ Stories. I'm so glad you've decided to join us tonight for a gentle journey through time. Find yourself a comfortable position, perhaps adjust your pillow just so, and let yourself begin to settle in. Tonight, we're going to follow the soft, shimmering thread of one of history's most remarkable stories, the story of silk. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Feel free to share your location and time in the comments below. It's always wonderful to connect with listeners worldwide. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, please consider subscribing. That way, you'll be the first to receive new episodes that bring peaceful moments and fascinating stories into your day or night. Let's embark on today's journey together at a slow, restful pace.
You might think you know about silk. Perhaps you've felt its smooth coolness against your skin or watched the way it catches light in a shop window. But tonight, we'll discover something rather more wonderful. We'll walk alongside the people who first coaxed this precious thread from tiny cocoons, who carried it across deserts and mountains, who wove it into the fabric of civilization itself. This isn't a story of grand battles or mighty empires, though both will brush softly against our tale. Instead, it's the story of human hands, gentle, patient, skilled hands, and how they transformed the gift of a small caterpillar into something that would change the world in ways both subtle and profound. So let your breathing slow, let your shoulders drop just a little, and come with me now to ancient China, where our story begins on a morning much like any other, except that on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The year was 2640 BCE, or so the story goes, and the morning air carried the fresh scent of mulberry leaves still damp with dew. In the imperial gardens of the Yellow Emperor, a young empress named Lezu walked slowly among the trees, her silk slippers making the softest whisper against the stone pathway. The mulberry groves stretched out before her in neat, orderly rows, their leaves rustling so gently in the morning breeze that you might have mistaken the sound for distant rainfall. Lezu moved with that particular kind of quietness that comes naturally in the early hours of the day, when the world feels hushed and full of possibility. She was, by all accounts, a curious woman, the kind who had paused to examine an unusual flower or watch the path of an ant carrying its burden. And it was this curiosity that would, quite accidentally, change the course of human history. As she wandered deeper into the grove, something caught her attention. A small white object had fallen into the stone basin where she liked to sit and take her morning tea. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a bit of white stone, perhaps dropped by a bird. But as she leaned closer, she noticed something rather intriguing about its surface. The object seemed to shimmer, ever so slightly, and when the morning light struck it just so, it almost appeared to glow from within. Lazy dipped her finger into the warm tea, thinking to fish out what she assumed was a bit of debris. But the moment her finger touched the mysterious white object, something unexpected began to happen. A single thread, so fine it was almost invisible, began to unwind from the object. Then another, and another. The threads seemed to float in the warm liquid, catching the light in the most extraordinary way, like captured moonbeams or crystallized starlight. For several minutes, Lezu sat perfectly still, watching in quiet fascination as more and more of these impossibly delicate threads emerged from what she now realized was some sort of natural cocoon. The threads were unlike anything she had ever seen, smoother than the finest linen, stronger than it had any right to be, and with a luster that seemed to hold light within itself. But perhaps the most remarkable thing of all was how the threads felt between her fingers. As she gently lifted one from the tea, she discovered that it was not rough like hemp or scratchy like the wool from their sheep. Instead, it was soft beyond imagining, cool to the touch, yet somehow warm at the same time. It was as if she held a piece of the morning mist itself, made solid, but never quite losing its ethereal quality. What ZzZ had discovered there in that quiet garden with the mulberry leaves whispering overhead was silk. And though she could not have known it in that moment, she held in her hands a thread that would weave itself through the entire tapestry of human civilization.
In the weeks that followed that remarkable morning, ZzZ found herself returning again and again to the mulberry groves. She had, you see, developed quite an intense curiosity about these mysterious cocoons. Where did they come from? What sort of creature made them? And most intriguingly of all, could she find more? It was during one of these quiet investigations that she made her second discovery. High in the branches of an ancient mulberry tree, almost hidden among the broad green leaves, she spotted movement. At first, she thought it might be a bird, but as she watched, perfectly still and patient as only someone truly curious can be, she realized she was observing something quite different. Small, pale caterpillars moved slowly along the branches, their movements deliberate and somehow purposeful. They seemed to be eating, not frantically, as some insects do, but with a kind of meditative focus, each bite considered and careful. The sound they made was barely perceptible, a soft rustling that blended perfectly with the whisper of leaves in the breeze. As days turned into weeks, ZzZ watched these creatures with the dedication of a devoted student. She observed how they grew, how they molted their skin with what seemed like careful precision, how they chose exactly the right spot to begin spinning their cocoons. And in watching them, she began to understand something remarkable about the process. The caterpillars, she realized, were not simply creating shelter for themselves. They were artists, each one spinning its cocoon with a continuous thread that could stretch for nearly a mile when carefully unwound. The thread emerged from glands in their heads in a liquid form, then hardened almost instantly upon contact with the air, creating these impossibly long, impossibly fine strands.
But there was something else ZzZ noticed, something that would prove even more significant. The quality of the silk seemed to depend entirely on what the caterpillars ate. Those that fed exclusively on mulberry leaves produced the finest, strongest, most lustrous threads. Those that ate other plants produced coarser, less desirable silk. This observation led her to an experiment. What if she could control what the caterpillars ate? What if she could create the perfect conditions for them to produce the most beautiful silk possible? It was a thought that excited her, but also required patience. So much patience. She began collecting the caterpillars, creating small enclosures where she could feed them carefully selected mulberry leaves. She observed their entire life cycle, from egg to caterpillar to cocoon to moth, learning the rhythms of their existence. She discovered that timing was everything. Harvest the cocoons too early, and the thread would be weak. Too late, and the emerging moth would break the continuous strand. And slowly, very slowly, ZzZ began to develop what would become the foundation of an entire industry. She learned to reel the silk, to spin it, to weave it into fabric. But perhaps more importantly, she learned to see the process not as mere manufacture, but as a kind of collaboration with nature, a gentle partnership between human skill and the industrious work of these remarkable creatures. The silk that emerged from her careful tending was unlike anything the world had seen. It was strong enough for the emperor's robes, yet delicate enough for a baby's garments. It could be woven thin enough to seem transparent, or thick enough to provide warmth on the coldest nights. And always, always, it carried that distinctive luster, that quality of holding light that made even simple garments seem touched by magic.
As word of this miraculous new fabric spread throughout the imperial court, something rather interesting began to happen. The emperor, recognizing the extraordinary value of what his empress had discovered, made a decision that would shape the course of history for the next several thousand years. He declared the secret of silk production to be a closely guarded state secret, protected by the most severe penalties. The punishment for revealing how silk was made or for attempting to smuggle silkworms out of China was death. Not just death, mind you, but death by the most unpleasant means the imperial imagination could devise. This might seem harsh to us now, but you must understand, silk had immediately become more valuable than gold, more precious than jade. It was China's secret treasure, and they intended to keep it that way. Within the palace walls, a small, select group of women began learning the intricate arts of silk production. They worked in chambers that were carefully guarded, their activities hidden from curious eyes. These women became the keepers of perhaps the most valuable trade secret in human history, and they kept it with remarkable dedication. The process they perfected was intricate beyond imagination. It began with the careful tending of the silkworms, feeding them only the finest mulberry leaves at precisely the right times. The caterpillars had to be kept at exactly the correct temperature. Too warm, and they would become sluggish. Too cool, and they would fail to produce sufficient silk. When the time came for cocoon formation, the women would provide small bamboo frames where the caterpillars could spin their protective shells. The sound of this process was quite remarkable. Thousands of tiny creatures working simultaneously created a soft, continuous rustling, like gentle rain on leaves or distant ocean waves. Once the cocoons were complete, the most delicate part of the process began. The cocoons had to be harvested at precisely the right moment, then treated with hot water to soften the sericin, the natural gum that held the silk fibers together. This required extraordinary skill, as too much heat would damage the fibers, while too little would make them impossible to unwind. The actual reeling of the silk required hands so sensitive they could detect the slightest variation in the thread's thickness or strength. A skilled silk worker could feel, through her fingertips alone, whether a thread was about to break, whether it was of the finest quality, or whether it came from a cocoon that had been damaged in some way. The women worked in near silence, their movements fluid and practiced. There was something almost meditative about the process. The gentle motion of unwinding the threads, the soft splash of water in the basins, the quiet concentration required to maintain the perfect tension. Hours would pass like minutes as they worked, lost in the rhythm of their ancient craft. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this early silk production was how closely guarded the knowledge remained. Generations of women learned the craft, but they learned it within the protected walls of the imperial workshops. They knew that their skills were precious beyond measure,
and they treated that knowledge with appropriate reverence. The silk they produced was reserved for the imperial family and the highest nobility. Wearing silk became a sign of ultimate status, a visible demonstration of one's proximity to imperial power. The fabric was so precious that it was often used as currency, with bolts of silk serving as payment for everything from taxes to tribute from foreign lands.
For nearly 1,000 years, the secret of silk remained locked within Chinese borders. But secrets, like water, have a tendency to find their way out, no matter how carefully contained. And silk, being so extraordinarily valuable, created its own pressure for escape. The first hints of silk began appearing in distant lands through trade, but not as knowledge, only as finished product. Merchants from the West, traveling the dangerous mountain passes and desert routes that connected China to Central Asia, began bringing back small quantities of this miraculous fabric. The response was immediate and intense. In Rome, silk became the ultimate luxury, more prized than gold or precious gems. Roman senators' wives wore silk stoles that cost more than a common man might earn in several lifetimes. The fabric was so expensive that there were actually laws passed trying to limit its importation, as it was draining the Roman treasury of gold. But it was the mystery surrounding silk that made it even more precious. No one outside of China knew how it was made. Some believed it grew on trees like leaves. Others thought it might be combed from the fur of a special type of animal. The most creative theories suggested it was woven by a race of people who were half human, half spider. This mystery, combined with silk's extraordinary properties, created what we might recognize today as the world's first global luxury market. Trade routes began developing specifically to carry silk from China to the eager markets of the West. These routes would eventually become known as the Silk Road, though the people traveling them at the time had no idea they were creating one of history's most important commercial networks.
The early Silk Road was not a single path, but rather a network of routes that twisted and branched across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Merchants would travel these routes in stages, passing their precious cargo from one trader to another, each adding their own markup to the price. By the time Chinese silk reached Roman markets, it cost hundreds of times its original price. But the merchants who undertook these journeys were remarkable people in their own right. They were not just traders, but adventurers, diplomats, cultural ambassadors, and sometimes accidental historians. In their travels, they carried more than just goods. They carried ideas, technologies, religions, and stories. A typical caravan might take months to traverse just one section of the Silk Road. The pace was necessarily slow, dictated by the endurance of pack animals and the need to find water and shelter in hostile terrain. Merchants learned to read the land with extraordinary skill, knowing which stars to follow, which plants indicated water, which weather patterns meant danger. The sound of a large caravan moving across the desert was quite distinctive. The soft padding of camel feet in sand, the gentle tinkling of bells tied to the pack animals, the occasional call from one rider to another. At night, when the caravan stopped, there would be the sound of animals being tended, the crackle of small fires, and the murmur of conversation in a dozen different languages. These caravan stops became natural points of cultural exchange. Merchants from China would meet traders from Persia, from India, from the Roman territories. They would share information about routes, about prices, about political conditions ahead. But they also shared stories, recipes, music, and customs. In a very real sense, the Silk Road was creating the world's first global culture. The impact of this growing trade was profound. Cities that sat along the Silk Road routes began to prosper as never before.
Samarkand, Kashgar, Damascus, these names became synonymous with wealth and cosmopolitan sophistication. Local rulers quickly recognized the value of protecting and encouraging the silk trade, as the taxes and fees they could collect from passing merchants provided enormous revenues. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. The Silk Road was creating connections between civilizations that had previously existed in relative isolation. Ideas were traveling along these routes just as surely as silk was. Buddhism spread from India to China, largely through Silk Road connections. Islamic scholarship reached Chinese universities. Chinese inventions like paper and gunpowder eventually made their way to European markets. And through it all, silk remained the most prized commodity, the golden thread that made all this connection and exchange possible. Merchants might carry many goods, but it was silk that provided the profit margins necessary to make these dangerous journeys worthwhile. Silk was light, compact, imperishable, and universally desired. It was, in many ways, the perfect trade good for connecting distant civilizations. Yet still, despite all this trade and cultural exchange, the secret of silk production remained locked away in China. The Chinese authorities maintained their vigilant protection of this knowledge, understanding perfectly well that their monopoly on silk production was the foundation of their economic advantage in international trade.
While merchants traveled the dangerous routes carrying silk to distant markets, back in China, the art of working with silk was becoming ever more sophisticated. The simple techniques discovered by Empress Lizu had evolved into something approaching high art, with skills passed down through generations of dedicated craftspeople. The Chinese had discovered that silk's unique properties made it suitable for weaving techniques that simply wouldn't work with other fibers. Its strength meant that incredibly fine threads could be used without breaking during the weaving process. Its smoothness allowed for weaves so tight and even that the finished fabric seemed to glow with its own inner light. In the weaving workshops of ancient China, you would have found an atmosphere of intense concentration and quiet pride. The master weavers worked at looms that were marvels of engineering in their own right. Complex wooden structures that could handle dozens of different colored threads simultaneously, creating patterns of extraordinary intricacy. The sound of these workshops was quite distinctive. There was the rhythmic clacking of the loom shuttles, the soft whisper of threads being pulled into place, the occasional murmur of consultation between master and apprentice. It was a sound that spoke of patience, skill, and centuries of accumulated knowledge.
The patterns the Chinese weavers created were not mere decoration, they were visual stories, filled with symbolic meaning that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with Chinese culture. Dragons represented imperial power, phoenixes symbolized rebirth and renewal, clouds suggested the realm of the immortals. These motifs were woven into the silk with such skill that they seemed to move and shift as the fabric caught the light. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these early silk weavers was their development of what we now call brocade, silk fabric woven with metallic threads to create patterns that literally sparkled. The metallic threads were made by wrapping thin strips of gold or silver around silk cores, creating threads that were flexible enough to weave but durable enough to maintain their luster through years of wear. The process of creating these brocaded silks required extraordinary skill and patience. A master weaver might spend months creating a single length of fabric, working thread by thread to build up the complex patterns.
The concentration required was immense. A single mistake could ruin weeks of work, and there was no way to undo an error once it had been woven into the fabric. The weavers developed an almost mystical relationship with their materials. They learned to sense the mood of different silk threads, understanding that silk from cocoons harvested in spring had different qualities than silk from autumn cocoons. They knew that the tension of the threads had to vary slightly depending on the humidity of the day, the temperature of the workshop, even the phase of the moon. This intimate knowledge of materials extended to the dyes and colors used to create the rainbow of hues that characterize Chinese silk. The dyers were artists in their own right, masters of chemistry who could coax hundreds of different shades from plants, minerals, and insects. They knew that certain colors could only be achieved at specific times of year, when particular flowers were in bloom or when certain insects were most abundant.
The colors themselves carried deep cultural meanings. Imperial yellow could only be worn by the emperor himself. Anyone else wearing the shade risked death. Red was the color of celebration and good fortune. Blue represented heaven and immortality. The skilled dyers could create subtle variations within each color family, producing silks in shades that seemed to capture the essence of dawn light, ocean depths, or autumn leaves. Perhaps most remarkably, the Chinese discovered that silk could be painted as well as dyed. Using brushes and pigments, artists could create images on silk that rivaled the finest paintings on paper or canvas. These painted silks became treasured art objects, prized not just for their beauty, but for their incredible durability. Silk paintings could last for centuries without fading, their colors remaining vibrant long after paper paintings had deteriorated. The techniques for painting on silk required yet another set of specialized skills. The artist had to understand how pigments would interact with silk fibers, how to control the flow of paint across the smooth surface, how to create effects that took advantage of silk's unique properties. Some artists learned to paint on wet silk, allowing colors to blend and flow in ways that created almost magical effects. All of these skills, silk production, weaving, dyeing, painting, were closely guarded secrets, passed down through guild-like organizations that maintained strict control over their knowledge. The Chinese understood that their technological superiority in silk production was a national asset of incredible value, and they protected it accordingly. But despite all this secrecy, or perhaps because of it, the reputation of Chinese silk continued to grow throughout the known world, creating an ever-increasing demand for this miraculous fabric and the skills needed to work with it.
By the 6th century CE, the frustration felt by Western merchants and rulers over their complete dependence on Chinese silk had reached a breaking point. The Byzantine Empire, in particular, found itself paying enormous sums to Persian middlemen who controlled much of the Silk Road trade, and Emperor Justinian was determined to find a way to break this expensive dependency. The solution, when it finally came, arrived in the most unlikely form. Two Nestorian monks, whose names history has not recorded, approached the imperial court with an extraordinary proposition. They claimed to have traveled extensively in China and believed they could smuggle out not just silk, but the secret of its production. The plan they proposed was audacious in its simplicity. During their return journey from China, they would carry silk cocoons and mulberry seeds hidden inside their hollow bamboo walking staffs. The cocoons would provide the breeding stock for silk production, while the mulberry seeds would allow the cultivation of the only food the silkworms would accept. The risks were enormous. If caught, the monks faced not just their own deaths, but potentially the execution of anyone who would help them. The Chinese authorities had spent centuries perfecting their surveillance of the Silk Road routes, and they were particularly vigilant about anyone who might be attempting to steal their most precious secrets.
But the monks had advantages that typical merchants lacked. Their religious calling provided them with a certain protection, Even the most suspicious officials were generally reluctant to search holy men too thoroughly. Their knowledge of Chinese customs and language, gained through years of missionary work, allowed them to move through Chinese society with less scrutiny than foreign traders might attract. The journey took months, and every day brought new anxieties. The monks had to maintain the viability of the silkworm eggs hidden in their staffs, keeping them at the right temperature and humidity levels while appearing to go about their normal religious duties. Too much heat or cold, too much moisture or dryness, and their precious cargo would perish, making the entire dangerous enterprise worthless. They also faced the constant fear of discovery. At every checkpoint, every inn, every trading post, they risked exposure. Chinese officials had become extraordinarily skilled at detecting smuggling attempts, and the penalties for anyone caught trying to export silk-making knowledge had become even more severe over the centuries. But perhaps their greatest challenge was simply the physical demands of the journey itself. The Silk Road routes were notoriously difficult, passing through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Desert crossings could take weeks, with temperatures that soared during the day and plummeted at night. Mountain passes were treacherous, with sudden storms and avalanches that could bury entire caravans. The monks traveled slowly, deliberately, never attracting attention to themselves. They joined different caravans at different stages of their journey, always presenting themselves as simple religious pilgrims returning home. They participated in the evening conversations around the campfires, shared their food with fellow travelers, and generally behaved exactly as two monks should behave.
When they finally arrived in Constantinople in 552 CE, the monks carried with them something that would fundamentally alter the balance of economic power in the world. The silk cocoons they had smuggled out of China were still viable, ready to hatch into moths that could begin the first silk production outside of China in nearly 3,000 years. Emperor Justinian received them with appropriate ceremony, understanding immediately the significance of what they had accomplished. Here, at last, was the key to breaking Chinese monopoly control over silk production. The Byzantine Empire could now begin producing its own silk, freeing itself from dependence on the expensive and unreliable Silk Road trade routes. The first Byzantine silk workshops were established with extraordinary care and secrecy. The monks shared everything they had learned about silk production during their years in China. But this knowledge had to be adapted to different climatic conditions, different local resources, and different cultural practices. The mulberry trees grown from the smuggled seeds had to be carefully tended and protected. The silkworms had to be housed in specially constructed buildings that could maintain the precise temperature and humidity levels they required. Workers had to be trained in the delicate arts of feeding the caterpillars, harvesting the cocoons, and reeling the silk threads. But gradually, through patience and determination, the Byzantines succeeded in establishing their own silk industry. The quality of their early silk was not quite equal to the finest Chinese production, but it was silk nonetheless, and it was theirs to control. The economic impact was immediate and profound. No longer did the Byzantine Empire need to ship vast quantities of gold eastward to pay for silk imports. Instead, they could produce their own silk and even begin exporting it to other European markets. The city of Constantinople became a major silk-producing center, its workshops filled with the familiar sounds of spinning wheels and looms. But perhaps more significantly, the successful theft of silk-making technology marked the beginning of the end of China's monopoly. Once the secret was out, it was only a matter of time before silk production would spread to other regions, fundamentally changing the economics of this most precious fabric.
In the years following the monks' successful smuggling operation, Constantinople gradually transformed itself into one of the world's great silk-producing centers. The imperial workshops, established under the direct patronage of Emperor Justinian, became marvels of organization and technical skill, though they developed their own distinctly Byzantine character. Unlike the Chinese workshops, which maintained traditions stretching back thousands of years, the Byzantine silk industry was forced to innovate from the beginning. They had the basic knowledge of silk production, but they needed to adapt these techniques to local conditions, local materials, and local artistic traditions. The Byzantine silk workers developed their own distinctive style, influenced by the rich artistic heritage of the Eastern Roman Empire. Where Chinese silk often featured dragons and phoenixes, Byzantine silk displayed eagles, lions, and elaborate geometric patterns derived from classical Roman and Greek motifs. The color palettes were different too. The Byzantines favored rich purples, deep blues, and gleaming golds that reflected their imperial pretensions. The imperial silk workshops were located in special districts of Constantinople, carefully guarded and regulated. Only licensed artisans were permitted to work with silk, and the export of silk-making knowledge remained strictly controlled. The Byzantines had learned from Chinese example. They intended to maintain their own monopoly for as long as possible.
The organization of these workshops was remarkably sophisticated. Different buildings housed different stages of the silk-making process, from the silkworm nurseries to the final finishing areas where completed fabrics were inspected and prepared for use. The workflow was carefully planned to maximize efficiency while maintaining the highest possible quality standards. The silkworm nurseries were perhaps the most critical part of the operation. Byzantine silk workers had to master the delicate art of breeding silkworms in a climate quite different from their native China. They learned to adjust feeding schedules, temperature controls, and harvesting times to account for Constantinople's distinct seasonal patterns. The rearing rooms were kept at carefully controlled temperatures using ingenious heating systems that channeled warm air through hollow spaces in the walls. During the hot summers, the rooms were cooled using a system of wet cloths and strategically placed air vents. The workers responsible for tending the silkworms developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to their needs, able to detect the slightest changes in behavior that might indicate problems. The sound of the silkworm nurseries was quite distinctive, a soft, continuous rustling as thousands of caterpillars moved across their feeding trays, punctuated by the gentle voices of the workers as they went about their careful tending. There was something almost hypnotic about the rhythm of this work, the patient daily routine of feeding, cleaning, and observing that was essential to successful silk production. When cocoon formation time arrived, the workshops took on an air of heightened anticipation. This was the moment when weeks of careful preparation would finally yield their reward, or when problems that had been developing invisibly would suddenly become apparent. The workers would prepare small bamboo frames where the caterpillars could spin their cocoons, arranging them with the precision of a conductor orchestrating an orchestra.
The reeling process in Byzantine workshops developed its own distinctive characteristics. While Chinese silk workers had perfected techniques over millennia, Byzantine workers had to develop their methods through experimentation and adaptation. They created new tools and techniques suited to their local conditions and artistic goals. Byzantine silk reeling was typically done by teams of women who worked together with remarkable coordination. They would sit around large basins filled with heated water, each woman responsible for several cocoons simultaneously. The skill required was extraordinary. They had to maintain exactly the right tension on multiple threads while keeping them from tangling, all while working at the speed necessary to keep the silk from setting in the water. The workshop floors were covered with thick carpets to muffle sound and provide comfort for workers who spent long hours sitting.
The lighting was carefully arranged to provide maximum visibility without creating harsh shadows that might interfere with the delicate work. Bronze mirrors were positioned to reflect and amplify the available light, creating a gentle, even illumination throughout the workspace. The atmosphere in these workshops was one of quiet concentration and mutual respect. The women who worked there understood that they were engaged in something far more significant than simple manufacturing. They were creating the fabric that would clothe emperors, decorate palaces, and represent Byzantine power and sophistication throughout the known world. As the Byzantine silk industry matured, it began developing its own innovations and improvements to the basic techniques inherited from China. They discovered new dyeing methods that created colors particularly suited to their aesthetic preferences. They developed weaving techniques that allowed for more complex patterns and more efficient production. But perhaps most importantly, they began to understand that silk was not just a commodity, but a medium for artistic expression. Byzantine silk became renowned not just for its quality, but for its beauty. The way it captured and reflected light, the way it draped and moved, the way it seemed to transform anyone who wore it.
As the 7th and 8th centuries unfolded, the rapid expansion of Islamic civilization brought with it a profound transformation in the world of silk. The Arab conquests had swept across vast territories, from Spain in the west to the borders of China in the east, creating an enormous unified market for luxury goods and establishing new centers of learning and craftsmanship. The Islamic approach to silk was distinctive from the very beginning. While the Byzantines had focused primarily on imperial grandeur and the Chinese on traditional symbolism, Islamic artisans brought to silkwork a unique aesthetic sensibility rooted in geometric patterns, calligraphy, and a deep appreciation for the mathematical harmony underlying all beautiful things. In the workshops of Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba, silk workers developed techniques that seemed to make the fabric itself into a form of prayer. The patterns they wove were not mere decoration, but visual representations of the infinite complexity and perfect order they believed characterized divine creation. Geometric forms repeated and interlocked with mesmerizing precision, creating designs that seemed to pulse with inner life. The sound of Islamic silk workshops was different from their Byzantine or Chinese counterparts. There was the familiar rhythm of looms and spinning wheels, but overlaying it was often the gentle murmur of workers reciting verses from the Quran as they labored. The recitation served multiple purposes. It maintained a spiritual atmosphere in the workspace, helped workers maintain the proper rhythm for their tasks, and reminded everyone that their craft was ultimately an act of worship.
Islamic silk workers made several remarkable innovations that would influence the craft for centuries to come. They developed new methods for creating metallic threads, not just the gold and silver threads known to earlier craftsmen, but threads incorporating other metals that created entirely new visual effects. They learned to create threads that seemed to change color as they caught the light from different angles, producing fabrics that appeared almost magical in their shifting luminescence. Perhaps more importantly, they revolutionized the organization of silk production. Islamic silk workshops were often organized around extended family groups or craft guilds that maintained extremely high standards while encouraging innovation and artistic development. Master craftsmen took on apprentices not just to train them in technical skills, but to pass on aesthetic sensibilities and spiritual understandings that had developed over generations. The training process in these workshops was remarkably thorough. Young apprentices might spend months learning to identify different grades of silk by touch alone, developing finger sensitivity so acute that they could detect quality variations invisible to the untrained eye. They learned to spin thread with such consistency that their work could be seamlessly integrated with that of master craftsmen, and to dye silk in colors so precise that they could match existing threads with perfect accuracy. But perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Islamic silkwork was the integration of calligraphy into fabric design. Islamic craftsmen developed techniques for weaving Arabic text directly into silk fabric, creating garments and textiles that literally carried the words of poetry, religious verses, or historical inscriptions. The technical skill required for this work was extraordinary. Each letter had to be perfectly formed, properly proportioned, and elegantly integrated into the overall design.
The economic impact of Islamic silk production was profound. The unified Islamic world created trade networks that rivaled and sometimes surpassed the ancient Silk Road in their scope and efficiency. Silk produced in Spain might find its way to markets in Central Asia, while techniques developed in Persia could be rapidly transmitted to workshops in North Africa. Islamic merchants became master traders in silk, developing sophisticated financial instruments and commercial practices that made long-distance silk trade more reliable and profitable than ever before. They established warehouses and trading posts throughout their territories, creating a commercial infrastructure that supported not just silk trade, but cultural and intellectual exchange. The quality of Islamic silk became legendary throughout Europe and Asia. Christian crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought with them tales of silk fabrics so beautiful they seemed to capture starlight, so finely made that they appeared to be woven from air itself. These reports created enormous demand for Islamic silk in European markets, leading to trade relationships that persisted even during periods of military conflict. Islamic silk workers also made important contributions to the technical aspects of silk production. They developed new methods for treating silk fibers that increased their durability and luster. They created innovative dyeing techniques that produced colors of unprecedented intensity and permanence. And they invented new weaving patterns that allowed for more complex designs while actually simplifying the production process. The workshops themselves became centers of learning and cultural exchange. Craftsmen from different regions would travel to study particular techniques or aesthetic approaches, carrying knowledge and innovations back to their own communities. These workshops were not just manufacturing centers, but laboratories where the boundaries of what was possible with silk were constantly being explored and expanded. Perhaps most remarkably, Islamic silk workers managed to maintain the highest artistic and technical standards while significantly increasing the scale of production. They developed workshop organization methods that allowed large numbers of craftsmen to work together on complex projects while maintaining perfect consistency in quality and style.
While Islamic artisans were perfecting their craft in the workshops of the Middle East, another transformation was beginning in the trading cities of medieval Italy. Venice, in particular, was emerging as a commercial power that would fundamentally change how silk moved through the world, and eventually how it was produced in Europe. The Venetian approach to silk was, from the beginning, thoroughly practical and commercially minded. Where other cultures had treated silk as a luxury craft steeped in tradition and cultural meaning, the Venetians saw it primarily as a commodity that could generate enormous profits if properly managed and efficiently produced. Venetian merchants had been importing silk from Byzantine and Islamic sources for centuries, but by the 13th century, they began to recognize the advantages of establishing their own silk industry. They had access to the necessary raw materials through their extensive trading networks. They had accumulated significant capital from their commercial activities, and most importantly, they had developed organizational and management skills that could be applied to large-scale manufacturing.
The first Venetian silk workshops were established not by traditional craftsmen, but by merchant families who approached silk production as a business problem to be solved rather than an ancient art to be preserved. This perspective led to innovations that would transform the industry throughout Europe.
While Islamic artisans were perfecting their craft in the workshops of the Middle East, another transformation was beginning in the trading cities of medieval Italy. Venice, in particular, was emerging as a commercial power that would fundamentally change how silk moved through the world, and eventually how it was produced in Europe. The Venetian approach to silk was, from the beginning, thoroughly practical and commercially minded. Where other cultures had treated silk as a luxury craft steeped in tradition and cultural meaning, the Venetians saw it primarily as a commodity that could generate enormous profits if properly managed and efficiently produced. Venetian merchants had been importing silk from Byzantine and Islamic sources for centuries, but by the 13th century, they began to recognize the advantages of establishing their own silk industry. They had access to the necessary raw materials through their extensive trading networks, they had accumulated significant capital from their commercial activities, and most importantly, they had developed organizational and management skills that could be applied to large-scale manufacturing. The first Venetian silk workshops were established not by traditional craftsmen, but by merchant families who approached silk production as a business problem to be solved rather than an ancient art to be preserved. This perspective led to innovations that would transform the industry throughout Europe.
The Venetians also pioneered new approaches to silk dyeing that took advantage of their access to exotic dyestuffs from around the world. Through their trading networks, they could obtain rare and expensive colorants that were unavailable to their competitors, allowing them to produce silk in colors and shades that were unique in European markets. Perhaps most importantly, the Venetians understood that successful silk production required not just technical skill, but market intelligence. They maintained extensive networks of agents and correspondents throughout Europe and the Mediterranean who kept them informed about changing fashions, seasonal demand patterns, and competitive developments. This information allowed them to adjust their production to meet market demands with unprecedented precision. The social impact of Venetian silk production was significant as well. The workshops provided employment for thousands of workers, including many women who found in silk work opportunities for economic independence that were rare in medieval society. The prosperity generated by the silk industry contributed to Venice's emergence as one of Europe's great cultural centers, funding the art and architecture that would make the city famous throughout the world. By the 14th century, Venetian silk had gained a reputation for quality and style that rivaled the finest products from traditional silk-producing regions. European nobility began specifically requesting Venetian silk for their most important garments, and the city's silk merchants found themselves invited to courts throughout Europe to display their latest creations. The success of the Venetian silk industry also had important technological implications. The innovations developed in Venetian workshops, particularly in the areas of machinery and production organization, would eventually spread to other Italian cities and then throughout Europe, laying the groundwork for the industrial transformation that would revolutionize European manufacturing in later centuries. But perhaps most significantly, the Venetian approach to silk production demonstrated that this ancient craft could be successfully adapted to new economic and social conditions, while maintaining its essential character and appeal. The silk produced in Venetian workshops was unmistakably a product of its time and place, reflecting Venetian values and aesthetic sensibilities, while remaining true to the fundamental qualities that had made silk precious for thousands of years.
As the Renaissance began to flower across Italy in the 15th century, silk found itself at the very heart of a cultural transformation that would reshape European society. This was an age when art, politics, fashion, and commerce were becoming increasingly intertwined, and silk
with its unique combination of beauty, luxury, and symbolic power, became the medium through which many of the era's most important social and cultural statements were made. In the courts of Milan, Florence, and Naples, silk was no longer simply a fabric for clothing, but had become a form of artistic expression in its own right. The great silk workshops of northern Italy began collaborating with painters, sculptors, and architects to create textiles that were, quite literally, works of art. These collaborations produced silk fabrics with designs of unprecedented sophistication and beauty. The technical innovations required to realize these artistic visions pushed silk production to new levels of complexity and refinement. Italian silk workers developed new weaving techniques that could create fabric with multiple layers of imagery, where different patterns would become visible depending on how light struck the surface. They learned to incorporate threads made from materials other than silk, including fine gold and silver wire, and even threads spun from precious gems, creating fabrics that seemed to glow with inner light. The workshops themselves became something approaching theatrical spaces, where the creation of beautiful objects was treated as a form of performance art. Master weavers worked with the deliberate precision of surgeons, their movements so practiced and elegant that observers compared them to dancers. The sound of these workshops was like chamber music, the rhythmic interplay of multiple looms creating complex polyrhythmic patterns that seemed to embody the mathematical harmony that Renaissance thinkers saw as underlying all beautiful things.
Perhaps no figure better exemplified the Renaissance approach to silk than Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter of Pope Alexander VI and one of the most fascinating and controversial figures of her age. Lucrezia understood silk not just as luxury, but as a form of political communication, a way of projecting power, sophistication, and cultural authority that could be read and understood by anyone who saw her. Her wardrobe was legendary throughout Europe, featuring silk garments of such extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship that they were discussed in diplomatic correspondence and described in detail by foreign ambassadors. Each garment was designed to convey specific messages about her status, her family's power, her personal refinement, and her political allegiances. But Lucrezia was not simply a consumer of silk. She was an active participant in its creation and development. She maintained her own silk workshops, staffed with the finest craftsmen she could recruit from throughout Italy and beyond. These workshops became experimental laboratories where new techniques were developed and new aesthetic possibilities explored. The silk production process in Lucrezia's workshops began with the most careful selection of raw materials. Her agents scoured the silk-producing regions of Italy and imported the finest threads from as far away as China and Persia. The silkworms in her estates were fed only on mulberry leaves that had been specifically cultivated for their nutritional content, producing silk of exceptional strength and luster.
The dyeing processes used in her workshops incorporated techniques learned from Islamic craftsmen, Byzantine masters, and innovative Italian chemists. Colors were achieved through complex processes that might take weeks to complete, using rare and expensive materials imported from around the world. The resulting palette included shades that had never been seen before. Colors so subtle and sophisticated that they seemed to exist in a realm beyond the ordinary spectrum. The weaving itself was approached as a form of collaborative artistry. Lucrezia would work closely with her master weavers to develop designs that incorporated elements from classical antiquity, contemporary artistic movements, and her own personal aesthetic vision. These designs were then translated into detailed patterns that required extraordinary skill to execute.
The finished products were silk fabrics that represented the absolute pinnacle of Renaissance craftsmanship and artistic achievement. They featured imagery drawn from classical mythology, contemporary literature, and personal symbolism that reflected Lucrezia's education, political connections, and cultural sophistication. The level of detail was extraordinary. Individual threads were positioned with the precision of brush strokes in a painting. But perhaps most remarkably, these fabrics were designed to be more than static decorative objects. They were created to move and change as the wearer moved, with patterns that would shift and transform as light struck them from different angles. This kinetic quality meant that silk garments became a form of performance art, where the act of wearing them was itself an artistic statement. The influence of Lucrezia's approach to silk extended far beyond her own wardrobe. Her workshops became training centers where craftsmen from throughout Europe came to learn new techniques and aesthetic approaches. The innovations developed under her patronage spread throughout Italy and then across the continent, influencing silk production for centuries to come. The social and cultural impact was equally significant. Lucrezia's use of silk helped establish new standards for court fashion and ceremonial dress that would be adopted by nobility throughout Europe. More importantly, her approach demonstrated that silk could be a medium for sophisticated artistic and intellectual expression, not simply ostentatious display of wealth. This transformation of silk from luxury commodity to artistic medium would prove to be one of the Renaissance's most lasting contributions to European culture. It established aesthetic and technical standards that would influence textile production long after the political and social structures of Renaissance Italy had disappeared.
As the 17th century dawned across Europe, the center of silk sophistication was beginning to shift northward from Italy to France. This transition would reach its spectacular culmination during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose court at Versailles would establish new standards of luxury and refinement that would influence European fashion and silk production for generations to come. The French approach to silk was distinctive from the very beginning. Where the Italians had emphasized artistic innovation and the integration of silk with other art forms, the French focused on creating a complete aesthetic system where every element, from the architecture of royal palaces to the cut of courtiers' garments, worked together to project an image of absolute royal authority and cultural supremacy. Louis XIV understood silk's power as a form of political communication, perhaps better than any ruler before or since. He recognized that the visual impact of his court, the impression it made on foreign ambassadors and domestic subjects alike, was crucial to maintaining the mystique of absolute monarchy. Silk, with its unique capacity to capture and reflect light, its ability to transform the human figure, and its associations with luxury and refinement, became central to his strategy for projecting royal power. The silk workshops established under royal patronage in Lyon represented a new model for luxury production. These were not simply manufacturing centers, but carefully organized enterprises that brought together the finest craftsmen from throughout Europe under unified artistic direction. The goal was not just to produce beautiful silk, but to create a distinctly French silk aesthetic that would be recognized and admired throughout the civilized world. The technical innovations developed in French silk workshops during this period were remarkable. French craftsmen perfected techniques for creating silk fabrics with patterns so complex and detailed that they required looms with hundreds of individual threads, each controlled separately. The precision required was extraordinary. A single mistake could ruin weeks of work, and there was no possibility of correction once an error had been woven into the fabric. The patterns themselves reflected the Baroque aesthetic that dominated Louis XIV's court. They featured elaborate floral motifs, complex geometric designs, and classical imagery drawn from Greek and Roman mythology.
But these elements were combined in ways that created entirely new visual effects, patterns that seemed to move and breathe as the fabric caught different light, designs that created optical illusions of depth and dimensionality that had never been achieved before. The color palette developed by French silk dyers was equally revolutionary. Working with chemists and natural philosophers, they created dyes that produced colors of unprecedented intensity and permanence. The famous French blue became sought after throughout Europe, as did their deep crimsons, rich golds, and subtle pastels that seemed to glow with inner light. Perhaps most importantly, the French developed a completely integrated approach to silk fashion that considered not just individual garments, but entire ensembles. They understood that silk's visual impact depended not just on the fabric itself, but on how it was cut, how it was combined with other materials, how it moved as the wearer moved, and how it interacted with architectural spaces and lighting conditions.
The court at Versailles became a kind of theater where silk played the starring role. Every appearance the king made, every ceremony and entertainment was carefully choreographed to maximize the visual impact of silk garments. The palace itself was designed with silk fashion in mind. The lighting, the mirrors, the architectural proportions, all carefully calculated to display silk to maximum advantage. The economic impact of this royal patronage was enormous. The French silk industry, centered in Lyon, became the most sophisticated and productive in the world. Thousands of workers were employed in silk production, from the cultivation of mulberry trees to the final finishing of luxury garments. The export of French silk and silk goods became a major source of national revenue, helping to finance the Sun King's ambitious building projects and military campaigns. But the cultural impact was even more significant. The French court's approach to silk fashion established standards and expectations that would influence European society for centuries. The idea that clothing could be a form of art, that fashion could be a legitimate area for serious aesthetic consideration, that luxury could be a form of cultural achievement, all of these concepts were developed and popularized through the French court's sophisticated use of silk. The training systems developed in French silk workshops became models for luxury crafts throughout Europe. Young artisans would travel from across the continent to study in Lyon, learning not just technical skills, but aesthetic sensibilities that they would carry back to their home countries. This created a kind of international silk culture, centered in France, but extending throughout the European cultural sphere. The French also pioneered new approaches to silk merchandising and retail. They developed sophisticated systems for displaying silk goods, for educating customers about quality and style, and for creating desire for particular silk products. These innovations would later influence the development of modern retail practices in many other industries. Perhaps most remarkably, the French managed to maintain silk production as a luxury craft, while significantly expanding its scale and market reach. They demonstrated that it was possible to meet growing demand for silk goods without compromising the aesthetic standards and technical excellence that made French silk the most desirable in the world. The legacy of this period would extend far beyond the reign of Louis XIV. The aesthetic principles developed in French silk workshops, the technical innovations pioneered by French craftsmen, and the cultural associations created by the French court would continue to influence silk production and silk fashion throughout the modern era. As the 18th century progressed toward its revolutionary conclusion, the ancient craft of silk production stood at the threshold of the most dramatic transformation in its long history. The Industrial Revolution that was beginning to reshape European society would have profound implications for every aspect of silk manufacturing, from the care of silkworms to the final finishing of luxury fabrics. The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the workshops and mills of northern England and industrial France. Inventors and entrepreneurs, many of them with no previous connection to the silk trade, began applying the mechanical innovations that were revolutionizing cotton and wool production to the challenges of working with silk. The first breakthrough came in the area of silk throwing, the process of twisting raw silk threads to give them the strength and characteristics needed for weaving. Traditional silk throwing had always been a laborious hand process, requiring skilled workers and producing limited quantities of finished thread. But in 1717, an Italian engineer named John Loam successfully established the first silk throwing mill in England, using machinery that could produce thrown silk much more quickly and consistently than hand methods. The sound of Loam's mill was unlike anything that had been heard in the silk industry before. Instead of the quiet whisper of hand spinning, there was a constant mechanical rumbling punctuated by the rhythmic clacking of hundreds of spindles working in perfect synchronization. The mill operated continuously, day and night, producing quantities of thrown silk that would have required dozens of skilled handworkers.
But the mechanization of silk production was not simply a matter of replacing hand labor with machinery. It required fundamental rethinking of the entire production process, from the organization of work, to the training of workers, to the management of quality control. The traditional silk workshops, with their emphasis on individual craftsmanship and artisanal skill, had to be transformed into something approaching modern factories. This transformation was not without its controversies and challenges. Skilled silk workers, many of whom had spent years learning their craft, found themselves displaced by machinery that could perform their work more quickly and cheaply. There were riots and protests in some silk-producing regions, as traditional craftsmen struggled to adapt to the new industrial reality. But there were also remarkable opportunities. The increased efficiency of mechanical silk production meant that silk goods could be made available to a much broader segment of society. Products that had once been available only to the wealthiest aristocrats could now be afforded by the growing middle classes of industrial Europe. The quality implications of mechanization were complex and sometimes contradictory. In some ways, mechanical production could achieve greater consistency than hand methods. Machines didn't have off days or vary in their technique. But machines also couldn't make the subtle adjustments and refinements that skilled craftsmen could provide. The challenge for silk manufacturers was to combine mechanical efficiency with the aesthetic standards that had made silk precious for thousands of years.
Perhaps the most significant innovation of this period was the development of the jacquard loom, invented by Joseph Marie Jacquard in 1804. This remarkable machine used a system of punched cards to control the weaving process, allowing for the creation of complex patterns that had previously required the skills of master weavers. The jacquard loom represented a fundamental breakthrough in the mechanization of complex manufacturing processes. The sound of a jacquard loom in operation was quite distinctive, a rhythmic sequence of clicks and clacks as the punched cards controlled the lifting and lowering of individual warp threads. Workers operating these looms needed different skills than traditional weavers. Instead of memorizing complex patterns and executing them through hand movements, they needed to understand mechanical systems and maintain precise operational procedures. The patterns that could be created on jacquard looms were limited only by the imagination of the designers and the number of cards they were willing to create. Silk fabrics began featuring incredibly complex designs, detailed landscapes, elaborate portraits, intricate geometric patterns
that seemed to pulse with mathematical precision. The level of detail that could be achieved was extraordinary, sometimes exceeding what even the most skilled hand weavers could accomplish. But perhaps the most profound impact of industrialization was on the global silk trade. Mechanical production methods could be established anywhere that had access to raw silk and mechanical power. The ancient geographical advantages that had made certain regions dominant in silk production began to erode as industrial techniques spread throughout Europe and beyond. The economic implications were enormous. Countries that had never been significant silk producers could suddenly enter the market with mechanically produced goods. Traditional silk-producing regions found themselves competing not just on the basis of quality and craftsmanship, but on industrial efficiency and cost control. The social changes were equally dramatic. The silk industry, which had traditionally been organized around family workshops and guild systems, increasingly became organized around industrial labor relations. Workers became employees rather than independent craftsmen, and their relationship to the silk production process became more specialized and limited. Yet despite all these changes, silk retained its essential character and appeal. Industrial production might have changed how silk was made, but it couldn't change what made silk special: its unique combination of strength and softness, its distinctive luster, its capacity to take dyes in ways that created colors of unprecedented beauty and permanence. The challenge for the industrializing silk industry was to harness the power of mechanical production while preserving the aesthetic qualities that had made silk precious throughout human history. This challenge would continue to shape silk production for generations to come, as manufacturers struggled to balance efficiency with artistry, quantity with quality, innovation with tradition.
As the 19th century unfolded, an ambitious dream began taking shape across the Atlantic Ocean in the young United States of America. American entrepreneurs and visionaries, inspired by the success of European silk production but determined to create something uniquely their own, began attempting to establish a domestic silk industry that could compete with the ancient silk-producing regions of the Old World. The American approach to silk was characteristically optimistic and experimental. Where European silk production had developed gradually over centuries, building on established traditions and accumulated knowledge, American silk pioneers attempted to leap directly into large-scale commercial production using the most advanced machinery and organizational methods available. The first serious attempt at American silk production was established in Paterson, New Jersey, in the 1840s. The choice of location was strategic. Paterson had abundant water power from the Great Falls of the Passaic River, excellent transportation connections to New York City markets, and a growing population of skilled industrial workers who could be trained in silk production techniques. The Paterson silk mills represented something entirely new in the history of silk production. These were not traditional workshops or even European-style manufactories, but true industrial factories designed from the ground up for efficient, large-scale silk production. The buildings were vast brick structures, several stories high, with rows of large windows designed to provide maximum natural light for the intricate work of silk production.
The sound of these mills was distinctly American in its intensity and scale. Hundreds of looms operated simultaneously, creating a mechanical symphony that could be heard for blocks around the factory buildings. Steam engines provided power with a constant rhythmic pounding that became part of the industrial soundtrack of cities like Paterson. The scale was enormous compared to anything that had existed in silk production before. American silk workers came from remarkably diverse backgrounds. Some were skilled craftsmen recruited from European silk centers, bringing with them centuries of accumulated knowledge and technique. Others were immigrants from rural areas who learned silkwork as their introduction to industrial employment. Still others were women and children who found in the silk mills some of the first opportunities for regular wage employment available to them in American society. The working conditions in these mills were challenging by any standard. The work required intense concentration and precise hand movements, but it had to be performed in buildings that were often poorly ventilated, inadequately heated, and filled with the constant noise of machinery. Workers typically worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, with only brief breaks for meals. Yet there was also something undeniably exciting about these American silk ventures. They represented a kind of industrial optimism that was characteristic of 19th century America. The belief that through ingenuity, hard work, and the application of advanced technology, Americans could master any craft or industry, no matter how ancient or complex its traditions.
The technical challenges facing American silk producers were enormous. They had to master not just the mechanical aspects of silk production, but the subtle biological and chemical processes that determined the quality of the final product. Silkworm cultivation had to be adapted to American climatic conditions and agricultural practices. Dyeing processes had to be modified to work with American water chemistry and locally available materials. Some of the innovations developed by American silk producers were genuinely revolutionary. They pioneered new methods for controlling humidity and temperature in silkworking environments, creating conditions that allowed for more consistent production than had been possible in traditional workshops. They developed new dyeing techniques that took advantage of American chemical industry innovations, producing colors that were both more vibrant and more permanent than traditional methods could achieve. Perhaps most importantly, Americans brought to silk production a democratic sensibility that was quite different from the aristocratic traditions of European silk manufacture. While European silk had been primarily focused on luxury goods for wealthy customers, American silk producers aimed to create high-quality products that could be afforded by middle-class customers. This democratizing impulse led to innovations in silk product design and manufacturing that would influence the industry worldwide. American silk manufacturers developed new fabric weights and weaves that were suitable for everyday wear, not just special occasions. They created silk goods that were durable enough for practical use, while retaining the beauty and luxury associations that made silk special.
The economic impact of American silk production was significant, even though it never achieved the complete success that its pioneers had envisioned. At its peak in the late 19th century, the American silk industry employed tens of thousands of workers and produced silk goods worth millions of dollars annually. Cities like Paterson became known throughout the world as silk-producing centers. But perhaps more important than the economic impact was the cultural significance of American silk production. It represented a kind of industrial coming of age for the United States, a demonstration that American workers and entrepreneurs could master the most sophisticated manufacturing processes and compete with the established industries of Europe. The American silk experiment also highlighted some of the tensions and challenges that would characterize industrial production throughout the modern era. The conflict between efficiency and craftsmanship, between quantity and quality, between innovation and tradition. All of these tensions were played out in the American silk mills of the 19th century. Labor relations in the silk industry became a model for industrial labor organizing throughout American manufacturing. Silk workers were among the first American industrial employees to organize unions, to demand better working conditions, and to use strikes and other collective action to improve their circumstances. The strikes and labor conflicts that periodically shut down American silk production became national news, focusing public attention on the working conditions and social implications of industrial manufacturing. These conflicts helped shape American attitudes toward industrial labor relations and contributed to the development of modern labor law and regulation.
As the 19th century drew toward its close, a magnificent new transportation marvel was about to transform the movement of silk across continents in ways that would have seemed impossible to the ancient Silk Road merchants. The Orient Express, that legendary train that connected Paris to Constantinople and beyond, represented more than just luxurious travel. It was a symbol of how modern technology was shrinking the world and making the global trade in precious goods faster, safer, and more reliable than ever before. The inaugural journey of the Orient Express in 1883 marked the beginning of a new era in international silk trade. For the first time in history, silk merchants could transport their most precious goods from the workshops of the East to the markets of Western Europe in a matter of days rather than months, and with a level of security and comfort that the old caravan routes could never have provided. The train itself was a masterpiece of 19th century luxury, and silk played a central role in its opulent appointments. The passenger compartments were upholstered in the finest silk damasks, woven in patterns that captured and reflected the gentle light of the train's gas lamps. The dining car featured silk curtains that could be drawn to create intimate spaces for conversation and business dealings. Even the sleeping berths were appointed with silk linens that provided both comfort and elegance.
The sound of the Orient Express was unlike anything the silk trade had known before. Instead of the gentle tinkling of camel bells or the creak of wooden wagon wheels, there was the rhythmic clacking of steel wheels on rails, the distant whistle of the locomotive, and the subtle vibration of the carriages that created an oddly soothing environment for both passengers and cargo. For silk merchants, the Orient Express represented a revolution in business practices. Negotiations that once required months of careful correspondence could now be conducted face-to-face during the journey. Samples could be examined under proper lighting conditions. Quality could be assessed, prices negotiated, and contracts signed, all while traveling in comfort and security across the European continent. The train carriages designated for silk transport were specially designed to protect these delicate goods from the vibrations and temperature fluctuations that could damage fine fabrics. Silk bales were packed in custom wooden containers lined with cedar to protect against moisture and insects. Temperature was carefully controlled through a system of ventilation that maintained consistent conditions throughout the journey. But perhaps most significantly, the Orient Express created new opportunities for cultural exchange in the silk trade. Merchants, craftsmen, and designers from different silk-producing regions found themselves traveling together, sharing techniques, discussing innovations, and forming business relations that would have been impossible under the old trading systems. The dining car conversations on the Orient Express often resembled informal international conferences on silk production and trade. A Byzantine silk dyer might find himself sharing a meal with a Lyonnaise weaver, while a Venetian merchant discussed market conditions with a Constantinopolitan broker. These interactions led to rapid dissemination of technical innovations and artistic ideas throughout the silk-producing world.
The influence of the Orient Express on silk fashion was immediate and profound. Paris, as the western terminus of the line, became the natural meeting point for silk traders from throughout Europe and the Near East. This concentration of silk expertise and inventory transformed Paris into the undisputed capital of silk fashion, a position it would maintain well into the 20th century. Parisian silk merchants began receiving regular shipments of the finest Oriental silks, often still carrying the subtle fragrances of the workshops where they had been created. These silks brought with them not just new materials, but new aesthetic influences that would reshape European fashion. Oriental patterns, colors, and weaving techniques began appearing in Parisian silk designs, creating a new international style that combined Eastern sophistication with Western technical innovation. The speed of the Orient Express also transformed the fashion cycle. Instead of seasonal changes in silk styles, fashion could now respond to more frequent impulses. A new silk design created in Constantinople could be on display in Paris within a week. Market preferences observed in Western Europe could be communicated back to Eastern producers and incorporated into new production within a matter of days. This acceleration of the fashion cycle created new opportunities for silk producers who could respond quickly to changing tastes, while creating new challenges for those who were accustomed to the slower rhythms of traditional silk trade. The most successful silk merchants of this era were those who learned to balance the ancient virtues of patience and craftsmanship with the modern demands for speed and responsiveness. The social impact of the Orient Express on the silk trade was equally significant. The train created a new international class of silk professionals, merchants, designers, and craftsmen who were equally at home in Paris, Vienna, or Constantinople. These cosmopolitan silk traders became cultural ambassadors, carrying not just goods, but ideas, artistic influences, and technological innovations across national and cultural boundaries. The Orient Express also democratized luxury travel in ways that had important implications for the silk trade. While the train was certainly expensive, it was far less costly than the private transportation arrangements that international silk merchants had previously required. This made it possible for smaller silk traders to participate in international commerce, increasing competition and innovation throughout the industry. Perhaps most remarkably, the Orient Express helped preserve traditional silk-making regions and techniques by making them more accessible to international markets. Remote workshops that might otherwise have been overwhelmed by industrial competition could now reach sophisticated customers who valued traditional craftsmanship and were willing to pay premium prices for authentic traditional silks. The legendary luxury of the Orient Express itself became a marketing tool for the silk trade. Silk goods that had traveled on the Orient Express carried a cachet that added significantly to their value in Western European markets. The association with luxury travel, international sophistication, and exotic origins created a powerful brand image that silk merchants learned to exploit effectively.
In the final decades of the 19th century, as the industrial world was transforming silk production in ways both marvelous and troubling, a remarkable woman on the other side of the world was quietly revolutionizing silkworm cultivation through methods that would have been perfectly familiar to Empress Lizhu 3,000 years earlier. The Dowager Empress Cixi of China, one of the most powerful and enigmatic figures of her age, maintained private silk gardens within the Forbidden City that represented both a connection to ancient traditions and a subtle form of resistance to the modern world that was encroaching on Chinese sovereignty. These imperial silk gardens were hidden away behind walls within walls, accessible only to the empress herself and a small group of trusted attendants who had sworn binding oaths of secrecy. The gardens were not mentioned in any official court records, and their existence was known only through whispered conversations and cryptic references in private diaries that would not be discovered until decades after the empress's death. The gardens themselves were marvels of careful design and patient cultivation. Ancient mulberry trees, some supposedly dating back centuries, provided shade and sustenance for carefully tended populations of silkworms whose lineage could be traced through generations of imperial breeding programs.
The trees were arranged in patterns that created natural windbreaks while maximizing the quality of leaves available for feeding the precious caterpillars. The sound in these gardens was remarkably subtle and peaceful. There was the gentle rustling of mulberry leaves in the breeze, the soft footsteps of attendants moving quietly through the pathways, and during cocoon season, the barely perceptible rustling of thousands of silkworms spinning their protective shells. It was a sound that spoke of ancient continuity, of processes that had remained unchanged despite all the upheavals in the world beyond the garden walls.
Empress ZzZ approached silk cultivation with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized her approach to statecraft. She personally supervised the selection of breeding stock, the timing of feeding schedules, and the harvesting of cocoons. She understood that silk production was not simply an industrial process, but a form of partnership with nature that required patience, skill, and deep understanding of natural rhythms. The silkworms in the imperial gardens were fed according to schedules that had been refined over generations of imperial silk makers. The mulberry leaves were harvested at specific times of day when their nutritional content was at its peak. They were prepared using traditional methods, washed in water that had been blessed by Buddhist monks, dried on special bamboo screens that allowed for perfect air circulation, and stored in conditions that preserved their freshness and palatability. The quality of silk produced in these gardens was legendary, even by the standards of Chinese imperial silk production. The threads were so fine they seemed almost transparent, yet stronger than any industrial silk being produced in the mechanized mills of Europe or America. The natural luster was so pronounced that fabric woven from these threads seemed to glow with inner light, creating optical effects that no synthetic process could duplicate. But perhaps more important than the silk itself was what these gardens represented for Empress ZzZ and for Chinese culture during this turbulent period. At a time when Western powers were forcing China to open its markets and adopt foreign technologies, the silk gardens stood as a quiet assertion that Chinese traditional knowledge remained valuable and relevant. The empress used silk from these gardens for the most important court ceremonies and diplomatic occasions. When she received foreign ambassadors, she wore robes made from silk that represented 3,000 years of unbroken Chinese silk-making tradition. The visual impact was subtle but unmistakable. Here was a ruler who understood and embodied the deepest levels of Chinese cultural achievement.
The techniques practiced in the imperial gardens were refined versions of methods that had been developed over millennia of Chinese silk production. The silkworm houses were built according to ancient principles of feng shui, oriented to take advantage of beneficial energy flows and natural ventilation patterns. The feeding trays were made from bamboo that had been harvested at specific lunar phases and treated with natural preservatives that enhanced the health of the silkworms. Temperature and humidity control in the silkworm houses was achieved through ingenious passive systems that required no mechanical intervention. Carefully positioned vents allowed air to circulate naturally, while water features created microclimates that maintained optimal conditions for silkworm development. The systems were so subtle and effective that Western visitors, when occasionally permitted to observe the gardens, often failed to understand how such perfect environmental control was achieved.
The spinning and reeling processes used in the imperial gardens followed traditional methods that emphasized quality over quantity. Individual cocoons were carefully inspected and sorted according to criteria so refined that only master silk workers could distinguish between different grades. The reeling was done by hand, with silk workers who could detect variations in thread quality that were imperceptible to mechanical testing methods. Perhaps most remarkably, the imperial gardens served as a living repository of silk-making knowledge that was being lost in other parts of China as industrial methods were adopted. Traditional techniques that had been passed down through generations of imperial silk workers were preserved and practiced exactly as they had been for centuries. The Dowager Empress understood that this traditional knowledge represented more than just technical skill. It embodied a complete worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between human activity and natural processes that was fundamentally different from the mechanistic approaches that characterized modern industrial production. The silk produced in these gardens was never sold or traded. Instead, it was used exclusively for imperial purposes, court ceremonies, diplomatic gifts, and religious offerings. This restriction helped maintain the mystique and special status of imperial silk, but it also meant that the superior techniques developed in the gardens had limited influence on commercial silk production. The gardens continued to operate throughout the final decades of the Qing dynasty, even as political upheavals and foreign interventions transformed Chinese society around them. They represented a kind of cultural sanctuary, a place where traditional Chinese values and methods could be preserved and practiced without compromise. When the imperial system finally collapsed in 1912, the silk gardens were abandoned and their secrets scattered. Many of the traditional techniques that had been preserved there were lost forever, taking with them knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and patient experimentation. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a remarkable artistic movement was transforming the world of decorative arts, and silk found itself at the very heart of this aesthetic revolution. Art Nouveau, with its emphasis on natural forms, flowing lines, and organic beauty, created entirely new possibilities for silk design and production that would influence fashion and decorative arts for decades to come. The Art Nouveau approach to silk was fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Where traditional silk designs had often been based on formal, geometric patterns or stylized motifs drawn from classical sources, Art Nouveau silk designers looked directly to nature for their inspiration. They studied the curves of flower stems, the patterns of insect wings, the flowing forms of water and wind, and translated these natural phenomena into silk designs of unprecedented grace and vitality. In the workshops of Paris, Vienna, and Glasgow, silk designers began collaborating with painters, sculptors, and architects to create fabric designs that were true works of art. These collaborations produced silk patterns that seemed to pulse with life, featuring sinuous botanical forms that appeared to grow and change as the fabric moved and caught the light. The technical challenges of translating Art Nouveau aesthetics into silk production were enormous. The flowing, organic lines that characterized the movement required weaving techniques that could create smooth curves and gradual color transitions. Traditional weaving methods, which were based on the perpendicular intersection of warp and weft threads, were not well suited to creating the fluid forms that Art Nouveau designers envisioned.
The solution came through innovations in jacquard loom programming and the development of new weaving techniques that could create optical illusions of curved lines through careful manipulation of thread colors and densities. Silk workers learned to create designs that appeared to flow in directions that defied the basic structure of woven fabric, achieving effects that seemed almost magical to observers unfamiliar with their methods. Color played a crucial role in Art Nouveau silk design. The movement's emphasis on natural beauty led to the development of new dyeing techniques that could produce subtle gradations and complex color interactions that mimicked the effects of natural light on flowers, leaves, and water. Silk dyers became colorists in the truest sense, learning to create palettes that captured the essence of dawn light, forest shadows, or ocean depths. The influence of Japanese art on Art Nouveau silk design was particularly significant. The opening of Japan to Western trade in the mid-19th century had introduced European artists to aesthetic principles and design approaches that were completely different from Western traditions. Japanese silk designs, with their emphasis on asymmetrical composition, simplified forms, and subtle color relationships, provided inspiration for a completely new approach to Western silk aesthetics. European silk designers began incorporating Japanese-inspired elements into their work, not through direct copying, but through a deeper understanding of the principles underlying Japanese aesthetics. They learned to appreciate the beauty of empty space, the power of suggestion rather than explicit representation, and the importance of balance and harmony in creating designs that were both visually striking and emotionally satisfying.
The social context of Art Nouveau silk production was quite different from traditional silk manufacturing. Many Art Nouveau designers were part of artistic communities that emphasized individual creativity and artistic expression over commercial considerations. They approached silk design as a form of fine art rather than simply decorative craft, and this attitude influenced both the aesthetic qualities of their work and the methods they used to create it. Art Nouveau silk workshops often resembled artist studios more than traditional manufacturing facilities. Designers worked closely with skilled craftsmen to translate their artistic visions into practical production methods. The relationship between designer and maker was collaborative rather than hierarchical, with each contributing their expertise to the creation of objects that were both beautiful and functional. The market for Art Nouveau silk was primarily among the emerging middle classes of industrial Europe and America, people who had sufficient wealth to afford luxury goods, but who were not bound by the conservative tastes of traditional aristocracy. These customers appreciated the innovative aesthetics of Art Nouveau silk and were willing to experiment with new styles and approaches to fashion and interior decoration. The influence of Art Nouveau on women's fashion was particularly significant. The movement's emphasis on natural forms and flowing lines complemented new approaches to women's clothing that emphasized comfort and natural body shapes rather than the artificial silhouettes that had dominated Victorian fashion. Art Nouveau silk designs were perfectly suited to the looser, more natural garments that forward-thinking fashion designers were beginning to create. The technical innovations developed by Art Nouveau silk producers had lasting influence on the industry. New weaving techniques, dyeing methods, and design approaches pioneered during this period would continue to influence silk production throughout the 20th century. More importantly, the Art Nouveau movement established the principle that silk could be a medium for serious artistic expression, not simply luxury consumption. Perhaps most significantly, Art Nouveau silk design helped bridge the gap between traditional handicrafts and modern industrial production. Art Nouveau designers demonstrated that it was possible to use industrial methods to create objects of genuine artistic merit.
paving the way for the design movements that would characterize the modern era. The legacy of Art Nouveau silk design can be seen in the work of fashion designers and textile artists to this day. The movement's emphasis on natural beauty, innovative technique, and artistic collaboration established principles that continue to influence how designers approach the challenge of creating beautiful and meaningful objects in an industrial age. The Art Nouveau period also marked the beginning of silk's transformation from a luxury commodity available only to the wealthy elite to a more broadly accessible material that could be enjoyed by anyone who appreciated beauty and quality. This democratization of silk would accelerate throughout the 20th century, ultimately making silk goods available to customers throughout the social spectrum.
As we move into the final chapters of our gentle journey through silk's remarkable history, we find ourselves in a world that would have been unimaginable to Empress Lezu as she sat by her mulberry tree so many centuries ago. The 20th and 21st centuries have brought transformations to silk production and use that are both thrilling and sometimes troubling, representing both the culmination of thousands of years of human ingenuity and the beginning of entirely new chapters in the story of this extraordinary fiber. The modern silk industry is a fascinating blend of ancient wisdom and cutting-edge technology. In laboratories around the world, scientists study the molecular structure of silk proteins, seeking to understand exactly what gives silk its unique combination of strength, flexibility, and beauty. This research has led to developments that would seem like magic to traditional silk workers. Synthetic silk produced by genetically modified bacteria, spider silk proteins manufactured in laboratory settings, and new silk varieties created through careful genetic manipulation of silkworms. Yet alongside these high-tech innovations, traditional silk production methods continue to thrive in many parts of the world. In remote villages throughout Asia, farmers still tend mulberry groves much as their ancestors did centuries ago. Silkworms are still fed by hand, cocoons are still harvested at the optimal moment, and silk is still reeled using techniques that have been passed down through generations of skilled workers. The sound of modern silk production is a complex symphony that includes both ancient and contemporary elements. In traditional workshops, you can still hear the gentle whisper of hand reeling and the soft clack of wooden looms. But in modern silk factories, these sounds are joined by the hum of electric motors, the precise clicking of computer-controlled machinery, and the quiet conversations of technicians monitoring production through digital displays.
The quality of modern silk production has reached levels that would have amazed even the most skilled craftsmen of earlier eras. Computer-controlled looms can create patterns of incredible complexity with perfect consistency. Modern dyeing techniques can produce colors that are both more vibrant and more permanent than traditional methods could achieve. Quality control systems can detect variations in thread thickness or strength that would be invisible to human inspection. But this technological sophistication has also raised new questions about what makes silk truly valuable. Is silk that is produced by genetically modified organisms still authentic silk? Do synthetic silks that replicate the molecular structure of natural silk deserve the same appreciation as the product of silkworms? How do we balance the efficiency and consistency of modern production methods with the cultural heritage and artisanal values that have made silk precious throughout human history? These questions are particularly relevant as the global silk market has become increasingly complex and competitive. China remains by far the largest silk producer in the world, accounting for the majority of global silk production. But silk is now also produced in countries throughout Asia, Europe, and the Americas, each bringing their own techniques, aesthetic traditions, and market approaches to this ancient craft. The democratization of silk that began in the industrial era has accelerated dramatically in the modern period. Silk goods that once would have been available only to royalty and the wealthy elite are now accessible to middle-class consumers throughout the world. This accessibility has brought silk to new audiences and new applications, but it has also created challenges in maintaining quality standards and cultural authenticity.
Modern fashion designers continue to find new ways to exploit silk's unique properties. Athletic wear made from silk blends provides natural temperature regulation and moisture management. Silk medical textiles take advantage of the fiber's biocompatibility and natural antimicrobial properties. High-performance silk fabrics are used in applications ranging from parachutes to surgical sutures. But perhaps the most exciting developments in modern silk are occurring at the intersection of traditional craftsmanship and contemporary technology. Artisan silk producers are using modern tools to revive traditional techniques that had been lost to industrialization. Digital design systems allow contemporary silk designers to create patterns that honor traditional aesthetics while pushing the boundaries of what's possible with modern production methods. The environmental implications of modern silk production have also become increasingly important considerations. Traditional silk production is inherently sustainable. Silkworms eat mulberry leaves, produce cocoons, and create no harmful waste products. But modern industrial silk production can involve chemical processes that create environmental challenges, leading to renewed interest in organic and sustainable silk production methods. Consumer awareness of these environmental and ethical issues has created new market opportunities for silk producers who emphasize traditional, sustainable, and socially responsible production methods. Customers are increasingly willing to pay premium prices for silk goods that are produced using methods that respect both environmental sustainability and traditional cultural practices. The cultural significance of silk in the modern world remains profound. Though it has evolved considerably from its ancient origins, silk still represents luxury, quality, and refinement, but it has also become a symbol of cultural heritage and traditional craftsmanship in an increasingly globalized world. Many regions that have long silk-making traditions are working to preserve and promote their distinctive silk-making techniques as forms of cultural heritage. UNESCO and other international organizations have recognized traditional silk production methods as intangible cultural heritage worthy of protection and preservation. Museums around the world now house collections of historical silk textiles that serve both as artistic treasures and as repositories of technical knowledge about traditional production methods. These collections provide inspiration for contemporary designers and serve as references for artisans working to revive traditional techniques. The story of silk in the modern era is ultimately a story about the relationship between tradition and innovation, between global markets and local cultures, between efficiency and authenticity. As we continue into the 21st century, silk producers, designers, and consumers are still working to find the right balance between honoring the ancient heritage of this remarkable fiber and exploring the new possibilities that modern technology and global markets provide. And so our journey through the long, winding history of silk draws gently to its close. We have traveled together from ancient Chinese gardens, where a curious empress first discovered the secret of the silkworm, along dusty caravan routes where merchants risked everything to carry precious bundles of shimmering fabric, through medieval workshops where patient craftsmen devoted their lives to perfecting their art, and into the modern world where ancient wisdom meets cutting-edge science in the continuing story of this most remarkable fiber. As you rest there, perhaps feeling your eyelids growing heavy, let yourself imagine for a moment the countless human hands that have touched silk throughout its long history.
the gentle fingers of Empress Leizu as she first lifted those miraculous threads from her tea, the calloused palms of Silk Road merchants as they carefully packed their precious cargo for another dangerous journey, the skilled hands of Byzantine silk workers as they created fabrics fit for emperors, the nimble fingers of Renaissance weavers as they transformed thread into art. Each of these hands added something to the story of silk, contributing their skill, their creativity, their dreams to the long chain of human endeavor that connects us all across the centuries. And in every piece of silk that exists today, something of all those hands remains, woven into the very structure of the fabric, like memories made tangible.
And perhaps that's the most wonderful thing about silk's long history. It reminds us that some kinds of human knowledge and skill transcend the boundaries of time and culture. The basic understanding that allows us to work with silk, the appreciation for its unique qualities, the desire to create beautiful things from its remarkable threads, these are constants that connect us to every generation of silk workers who have come before us. As your breathing deepens and your muscles relax, let yourself feel part of that long, continuous tradition of human creativity and craftsmanship. Let yourself rest in the knowledge that throughout human history, people have found ways to take the gifts that nature provides and transform them into things of beauty and meaning. The story of silk continues even as you rest. Somewhere in the world, silkworms are spinning their cocoons, silk workers are reeling threads, designers are creating new patterns, and people are discovering the pleasure of wearing or using something made from this most ancient and most modern of fibers. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as gentle and peaceful as silk itself, as enduring as the ancient traditions that have brought this remarkable fiber into our lives, and as full of quiet wonder as that first moment when Empress Leizu discovered the secret hidden in a simple cocoon floating in her morning tea. The threads of silk, the threads of history, the threads of human creativity and wonder, all woven together into one continuous, beautiful, eternal story that continues even now as you rest and dream.
This concludes our gentle journey through the remarkable history of silk. Thank you for joining us here at the ZzZ Stories. I hope this story brought you a sense of calm and a gentle escape into the past. If you found value in this experience, please subscribe to stay connected and to receive future episodes that continue to blend history with relaxation. I'm always interested in hearing from you. What topics or historical themes would you like to explore next? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Wishing you peaceful rest and a refreshed tomorrow. Until next time, take care and good night.